On today's episode of Locked On Pistons podcast, we are joined by friend of the podcast, Czar, to talk about whether the Detroit Pistons can catch the Milwaukee Bucks in the fifth seed. And also, the Los Angeles Lakers went pretty hard for Jalen Duren. What could this mean moving forward? We'll talk about all that today's episode, Locked On Pistons podcast. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Khahil. You can find me over on Twitter at Khahil. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We are free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel where we've reached 10,000 subscribers. Appreciate all of you guys for being real and holding it down, hitting that subscribe button for us and supporting the podcast. You can also leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So we'll get right into it. Obviously, we are joined friend of the podcast, Czar, sixth man of the year for the Locked On Pistons podcast, also of Bully Ball Media. We'll get right into this. All right, so we've had quite a few updates across the NBA. We're recording this on the 20th, and we've had a really sad injury update that none of us want to see, and we also got a suspension. And unfortunately, in one of the scenarios, the other one, I think the suspension was just a dumb decision and dumb mistake. But a lot of these happen to impact the Pistons. And one of them is Victor Wembanyama was diagnosed with a blood clot, and he will be missing the rest of the year. That is terrible. You hate to see it. That is terrible news, devastating news. No one wants to see that. And the other news is a suspension to Bobby Portis of the Milwaukee Bucks. I'm bringing this up to talk about this. Obviously, the Pistons are one game behind the Milwaukee Bucks of the fifth seed. Without Bobby Portis, that's going to be tough for the Milwaukee Bucks. Can they hold on to it? What's it going to look like down the stretch? Who knows? He's going to be missing basically the rest of the year due to this suspension. I bring up Wemby missing the rest of the year due to his unfortunate injury because the Pistons come out of the All-Star break and play the Spurs tomorrow at 8:30, and then they play them again towards the end of the year as well. So that's two games that they're going to be playing against the San Antonio Spurs where they won't be playing against Wemby. Pistons are playing well. Other teams maybe are not catching the best of breaks. Could this help the Pistons get to the fifth seed? So how realistic do you think it is the Pistons could catch Milwaukee at the fifth seed before the end of the season?
Very. I definitely see it as a possibility. Detroit has a lot of momentum coming into the All-Star break. And I think, honestly, since we did the offseason predictions episode, I said this was a team that I thought would really hit its stride in the second half of the season. And granted, we're a little past the halfway point now, but this is still a team that I think really their best basketball is ahead of them because they, for the most part, retained the same roster with making a sustainable addition with Dennis Schroeder at the deadline. And he addressed, obviously, there's the second star thing, but in terms of pressing on the court issues, backup point guard was number one. And they addressed that with probably the best person they could get with no Lonzo Ball available. So I really feel like this is a team that has momentum on their side and hopefully will continue to have, for the most part, have health on their side as well. I feel like Milwaukee kind of is the opposite end of the spectrum where, I mean, they have absolutely, made their season not be a disaster like it was looking to be in October, November. But it's definitely a team that does not have a lot of depth. And with losing someone like Bobby Portis, I feel like they're not in the best position to really replace those minutes. Not that I think Bobby Portis, because admittedly, he's not been very good for them this year. I know he's had a better stretch recently, but overall, hasn't really played the best. So it's not like they're losing Giannis for the season or for 25 games, but it's still going to hurt them. And if they get any more injuries or, suspensions or anything like that, that's something that definitely will affect them. But I think right now, even if you even put Bobby Portis on this team, I still think Detroit could catch Milwaukee with the 5 seed, just because I think they've been playing great basketball and so many things I feel have to go right for Milwaukee right now to stay in that 4-5 range. Obviously, Dame and Giannis, those are two you never want to bet against, but the rest of the roster is really thin. And not that Chris Middleton was anything near what everybody knows him to be. But replacing that with Kyle Kuzma, who's having his worst season probably ever, and I've not seen anything that really makes me think that he's turning it around. I don't see Milwaukee as really as dangerous as they can be. The only time I really do see Milwaukee as dangerous is when they play Detroit, because Brook Lopez like de-ages about 5 years every time they play, and then Giannis turns into like the MVP version of himself. And even last time Dame killed him. So it's just something that I think overall in the standings absolutely will benefit Detroit. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but they play Milwaukee twice at the end of the season. I don't know if that's within the 25 game suspension of Bobby, but if they don't have him during that game, that's also beneficial for Detroit as well. But it is kind of a stupid suspension, and I think 25 games for that is really excessive. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, so the Pistons play the Bucks the last 2 games of the year, so he would be able to return for those games, but nonetheless, they're going to be without him for 25 games. And kind of like you mentioned at the beginning, they the Bucks do not have a lot of depth at all. Like they are very 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 top heavy, and losing their backup center basically is going to, I think, obviously hurt them. Especially when they haven't been like thriving all year despite that. They had Bobby throughout the year, and like you mentioned, hasn't had the greatest of years. And Milwaukee is still, I don't want to say struggling, but it's not like they're surging either. And that's with Giannis having the, you might be saying he has the best year of his career. So like I feel like we've said that the last 4 years of his career, each year he's just getting better. But the team obviously hasn't been that great, and the Pistons are surging at the right time. You got Asar Thompson playing the best basketball of his career. I think Jalen Duren right now is playing the best basketball of his career. I think Cade Cunningham is playing the best basketball of his career. Like you mentioned, they went on and addressed the biggest, I thought, weakness to this team, which was the backup point guard minutes, the non-Cade minutes. And I think even more so to that, it really helps it is not only do they get Schroeder, and that's going to help, but they have kind of found another answer already, like that was already on the roster with Asar and how they've been using Asar. So now, beforehand, it felt like they had no other secondary creation. And over the last few weeks, it seems like, okay, well, now they may have multiple different guys that they can go to kind of set the offense up, get to the paint, and kind of create, force defense to get in rotation. So I think the Pistons are in a good position. Again, I absolutely hate to see this for Wemby. Wemby, I think I've, people have heard me say it multiple times. That dude's going to be the GOAT. But I absolutely hate to see him go down like this. It's terrible. No one wants to see it. But in the Pistons, from the Pistons perspective, come back against All-Star break without a Wemby on the team, and then you play him again in March without Wemby. That certainly helps the Pistons' chances to try to catch up to Milwaukee. I actually think what's going to be even more interesting is if the Pistons keep playing how we've seen them play over the last like 4 weeks, especially since January, and if Asar continues to play better and Jalen Duren remains how he's been playing, and Schroeder actually is that, that backup guard that you've wanted. Can they catch Indiana? Like could they catch the 4th seed too? Like they're only 2 games behind Indiana, and I went through this a few episodes ago. The Pistons schedule, it's not the easiest schedule, but it definitely isn't the hardest. They got a few, what I would call, I mean, the Pistons haven't elevated to the point where you should probably be calling anything a gimme game, but like games that you would say you should win those games. You got the Spurs without Wemby, the Hawks, you got the Nets, the Jazz, you got the Trailblazers, you got the Wizards twice, you got the Pelicans twice, you got the Mavs without, I think, well, AD might be back, but you got another game against the Pelicans, another game against the Spurs, the Raptors, the Kings. Like I think these are games the Pistons can win and certainly like finish above 500 the rest of the year. And who knows if they can do that? I think there's a real chance that we're not just talking about can they catch Milwaukee, but can they catch the 4th seeded Indiana Pacers?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely within the realm of possibility. Especially like it sounds far fetched. I feel like even for listeners right now, to say that Detroit could find themselves in that 4th seed by the end of the season. But like reality is, Detroit is a team that has had an insane swing of momentum since January, and honestly, like at towards December as well on like that West Coast trip, I feel like that was really like a turning point for not just the season, but the team as a whole. Like Cade started playing some of his best basketball. And he's already like this season was playing really great basketball, but really like hit another level after that West Coast trip. And it feels like even like the last 4 games before All-Star, I think what's really significant about those is they they obviously won, right? They're on a 4-game winning streak, but they won in like dominant ways, right? Like the Philadelphia game on ESPN, I feel like a lot of people penciled in as a loss as soon as they found out that Cade wasn't playing. And they went out to just flat out embarrass the Sixers on national
I thought
television.
that was I think that's going to be the swinging moment of the season.
Yep, and that was like a moment where JB kind of was forced to put Asar in that ball handler position where Asar is making plays for not only himself but other players on the court, and it really like paid dividends like immediately. And I feel like that's something that they realize they can really tap into and have done so ever since. And granted, you get Chicago 2 times, but you beat Chicago by an embarrassing margin on the first night, and then you go out on the second night, which might be kind of a trap game considering how bad the blowout was the night before, and Chicago is going to come in the next night, wanting to show some pride and not get themselves embarrassed on their home court again. And for the most part, it happened again. Obviously, it was a more competitive of a game, but Detroit like dominated throughout this stretch. And I feel like that's really significant because not only like is Asar really playing his best basketball, as you said, and Jalen Duren as well, but it's something that Detroit hasn't done all season is get wins from start to finish. They haven't been able to like carry a lead from first to fourth quarter because there was always that third or fourth quarter collapse that they had to come back from, and then they would maybe pull one out by the end of the game, right? And I feel like now Detroit's really learned how to win basketball games and like win them convincingly, and they know that they're the better team, but they also can't play down to their competition anymore. And I feel like that's something that's really huge for their development as a young core, because this is still a really young basketball team. And I feel like if they get that fourth seed, regardless, fourth, fifth, sixth, such a win for this season as a whole. And you can't help but be impressed just with the amount of progress that they've made in such a short amount of time.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Coming up, we'll talk about one of the guys of the young core that has really improved, Jalen Duren. The Lakers seem to have wanted him at the deadline pretty aggressively. Before we move to that, I just want to say quickly, you mentioned something that I've said a lot over the last few episodes. More than half the battle when it comes to your standing at the end of the season is just winning games you're supposed to win. It's not everyone. If you look at everyone's record outside the very top teams, you look at everyone's record against the top teams in the NBA, it's not going to be above 500. They're not dominating everyone's splitting hairs and losing to the best teams. It's about the teams that are handling business against the teams that are worse than them on the same level as them. That's how you elevate in the standings, and the Pistons are starting to do that. If they can do that the rest of the year, fifth seed I think is certainly certainly possible, and the fourth seed is not too far away. So we'll see what happens. But coming up, like I said, the Lakers seem to have really wanted Jalen Duren. There's a takeaway I have from the Pistons' perspective. You'll hear that coming up. All right, guys, you guys haven't heard this one before. DoorDash, NBA fans, get ready. They swoosh, they save. Thanks to Dash Pass, every time a player drops 50 or more points in a game, you score a huge deal the next day. It's simple. When any player scores 50 or more in a game during the 24-25 NBA regular season, Dash Pass members get 50% off an order up to $10 off the next day from noon to midnight. Here are a few ways you can take advantage of the deal. Game day feast you can have after an epic 50-point performance. Celebrate by ordering wings, pizza, or burgers from your favorite spot delivered straight to your door. Plan to catch the next game? Order your go-to snack and meals at a discount and get ready for more high-scoring action. Sign up for Dash Pass and be ready to save. When any player scores 50 or more in a game, Dash Pass members get 50% off an order the next day, up to $10 off. Just use promo code NBA50 from noon to midnight after a 50-point game on eligible orders at participating merchants. Must have an active Dash Pass account. Terms apply. Visit DoorDash to learn more. Again, must have an active Dash Pass account. Terms apply again with DoorDash. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Kind of fumbled that ad read at the very end there. I don't know what was going on. But thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button to the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. All right, so according to reports today, I read this off of Bleacher Report. This is from the Athletic beat writer for the Los Angeles Lakers. I believe you pronounce his name Jovan Buha. He says that the Lakers were really interested in Jalen Duren. They went aggressively after him at the deadline, then ended up going after Mark Williams. Now, we don't know what the exact offer was for Jalen Duren. We know what the Lakers offered for Mark Williams, which was Connect and two picks with Connect, which I thought at the time was a bit of a heavy, a bit of a heavy trade going to the Charlotte Hornets. But obviously that trade got sent back and all that. Zar, if you want to talk about it from the Lakers' perspective or why they would want Jalen Duren, you can. I'm going to go in the opposite direction. I want to talk about what this could mean for the Pistons moving forward, because Jovan also mentions that the Lakers probably will revisit this in the offseason. And that's where I want to go with this, because this offseason, there are going to have to be decisions made with the Pistons. I think a lot of people have talked about this, and I'm in agreement with this. Because Cade's extension kicks in next season and none of the other guys' extensions kick in, I personally feel like this is the offseason that if you are going to try to make a move, this would be the year I make that move. This offseason, if that's the route they want to go, they don't have to. But if they do want to make a move, I feel like this offseason would be it. When you still have the flexibility of around Cade's extension, it's still early in his extension. So if your first move doesn't work out, you can still kind of reset and go into another part two, if you want to call it, or whatever the next iteration would be. I feel like if that is the route that they want to go, I think this offseason should be the route they go. And the reason why this has brought that up to me is that JD and JI are both going to be up for extension this offseason. JD has played a lot better the last month and a half. He's been, I think he's been fantastic the last month and a half, playing some of the best basketball of his career. With that said, I do currently find it as a long shot that Trajan extends both JI and JD this offseason. I don't think I personally don't think it makes sense flexibility-wise. I don't think Trajan would go that route. Just let's leave it there. So if they don't decide that, hey, we want to extend both of these guys, what's going to be on the table there's going to be discussed of, okay, do we keep these guys around or do we use one of these guys potentially to go get another, get a bigger move, get a bigger star, make that big swing. And Jalen Duren, I would say, has to keep playing how he has the last month and a half for that to be off the table. I don't care if the Lakers were to show up in the offseason and try to go after Jalen Duren. If Jalen Duren plays how he's played the last month, I don't think that there's anything they could really do to get him. I think if he continues to improve how he's played defensively this past month with Asar Thompson, the offense continues to click with him and Asar on the floor, and he continues to play how he has with the ball in his hands offensively, I think the asking price would be pretty high if the Lakers showed up and tried to get Jalen Duren. And in that case, I don't even think if the Pistons were to have decided to trade Jalen Duren at that time, I don't think it's going to be for picks. I think it would be to try to go get like a star or something at that point. But my point is, seeing this report and seeing that, hey, teams are going to be checking in on these young guys in the offseason, it just got me thinking, like, look, the Pistons are having a fun season, but this offseason, we're really going to see them have to make some tough decisions. And Jalen Duren's play the rest of the year, I think, will have a big say in how things go this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, there's one way I could look at it in like the Lakers' perspective. It's pretty easy to see why they would want Jalen Duren. One, obviously, lob man for Luka and LeBron, like that's a dream for the Lakers, I'm sure. And they obviously want to pair Luka with a center that kind of aligns with the timeline that they have in mind for Luka. A center who's on the younger end of things, which also kind of allows them that flexibility because I think they expect to have Braun probably like another year or maybe two. So someone whose extension doesn't really kick in until Braun, eventually retires, I think is what they're going for. And it makes sense that Duren is that guy, and not to even mention like something Mark Williams hasn't really added to his bag that Duren has is like the playmaking, right? Like that's three playmakers technically in your lineup between Luka, LeBron, and Duren. Obviously, Duren the least of them, but like he can make plays with the ball in his hands, as we've seen. So it's easy to see why they'd want Jalen Duren. And I think especially like one thing that doesn't really get talked about a lot when it comes to kind of predicting how teams are going to go this offseason is the CBA, like the new CBA, because that's quite literally what controlled this trade deadline. Like there was a lot of talk leading up to the deadline of like, oh, like teams like the Pistons will control like the trade deadline because they have the most cap space and all that stuff. But I think what's really interesting about the way the league's heading right now is I don't know if it matters as much like in trade discussions in terms of like controlling, trades. I don't know if like being in the situation the Pistons were in this deadline really like made much of a difference at the deadline. You know what I mean? Like obviously like they facilitated trades to acquire cap space for second round picks, which I think two of them they kept and one of them they shipped out. I can't remember the details, but essentially they were able to maneuver to get Dennis Schroeder for basically nothing. That's great for them. But there's going to be a lot of teams that are looking for guys on the younger end of things because ultimately they're cheaper, and that's really what this is about. They are on cheaper contracts. They are higher end players than what you could get for someone who's more of a veteran along the same contract. And I feel like that's why guys like Duren, guys like Ivy, even Asar, not saying that they're all going to get traded or anything, but they're all going to be teams that are going to be players that teams have their eye on this summer. And I feel like no one is necessarily off limits, just generally speaking anymore. The Luka trade is quite literally like a perfect example of it. And even Mark Williams to a lesser extent, like, most of the time when a player is playing as well as Williams has for the Hornets this year, at was he 22 years old, like that's not a player that you often see and just get traded at the deadline for like, obviously not that connect and two first round picks is not like a substantial haul, but like that's not something you usually see. Like usually it's like, okay, we're gonna stick with this guy for a long time. So it's gonna be interesting. I feel like I agree with you. I don't think Duren and Ivy both get extensions. I feel like it's really likely that at least one of them doesn't. And I feel like there's going to be a lot of movement this summer in terms of just like higher end, like top star level players more than I think, especially last summer, because last summer wasn't really like insane for star player movement. I think this summer we'll have a decent amount of it. And I think a lot of it is like distrust on the player end for like, hey, like I heard, like, for example, Kevin Durant. I heard my name getting thrown in trade discussions when I never requested a trade. Like now I don't know if I want to be here. And then you got to think about like, well, what does Devin Booker do if, KD wants out and Bradley Beal doesn't want to leave and it's this whole thing. Guys like that, like you don't know who's going to be available. And I feel like Detroit kind of has to weigh their options and see if they really want to prioritize like maximizing that flexibility while they have it, because you never know what the future holds. And with injuries and things like that, like it's possible they extend a player and the player doesn't A, meet the potential, or B, like gets injured. Like you never know. So it's something that like they're gonna really have to weigh this summer. And I really feel like I agree with you. I think if there is a time to make that move, it's definitely this summer. They're ironically in a similar situation to Indiana last year, where Indiana was kind of on the up and up, and they have this all-star in Tyrese Halliburton, and now like yes, we have a young core that we like. And honestly, like they made moves without really sacrificing much of their young core. But they're gonna have to make a move to get that second guy, in my opinion. And I feel like what that costs, we'll see. But I think the best time for it is this summer.
Yeah, and one of the points that you brought up that I thought is definitely incredibly interesting is your point about the CBA and about these guys on smaller contracts being so valuable now. You, this deadline, you saw a bunch of moves that weren't like huge moves, but a bunch of like moves just to get teams underneath the luxury tax, just to get underneath the second apron. Like the Bucks kind of did a deal like that with Kuzma that helped them sneak under. You saw the Sixers do that deal with the Pistons. You saw multiple teams just trying to get underneath that, that apron line. And I do think, like you mentioned, that having that flexibility and having smaller contracts are going to be much more appealing to these, high level teams, and they're going to be calling teams like the Pistons, and combine that with where the Pistons are at in their rebuild right now, with how well they're playing, and then also heading into a summer where it looks like all of their first round picks now will be available to them. It feels like we're heading to like a collision course where this summer will be the summer that we see something happen. And for Jalen Duren and those who believe in Jalen Duren, I think if Duren can just play how he's played the last month, I think it's going to make it really hard to for Trajan to say we're moving on from this guy if he continues to play like this. So I would watch how he plays the rest of the year. I think his play the rest of the year really will, have a big say in what exactly happens this offseason. But
To add on to that really quickly, I feel like the decision that ultimately has to be made, and it's ultimately, I don't really think Asar is being put in these, talks or whatever, but the decision that they have to make between the three of them, because Asar will be extension eligible next summer, who of them provides the most to winning? Like who is directly, like when he is playing at his best, that is directly responsible for winning basketball. And I think that's a decision that they're going to have to make, and that's something they're going to have to pay attention to for the course of the season and the postseason as well.
we'll see what happens. Let's just get through this season. Hopefully the Pistons get up to the fourth, fifth seed, win a playoff game. Heck, maybe even win a playoff game like Cade's been asking for. Who knows what will happen? But this offseason for sure is going to be maybe one of the most interesting offseasons of the last 15 years for the Detroit Pistons. But we'll see what happens. Coming up, I want to talk with Czar about who he would like to see the Pistons match up with in the playoffs if and when they make it. Who is his favorite matchup for the Pistons? We'll talk about that coming up. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off and want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I've told you guys this many times over the last few years. I've been using FanDuel. I started using it a few years ago. Haven't stopped using it. It's super fun to use, super self-explanatory, super easy to use, but most importantly, obviously, is that it's super fun to use. So head over to FanDuel, and right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. All right, Czar. So the Pistons, as we've talked about, they're in the 6th seed right now. Have potentially a chance to get to the 5th seed, to the 4th seed. We know, I think most people are non-biased enough to say don't want to see Cleveland, don't want to see Boston. I think enough Pistons fans are, able to take the shades off and be like, you probably do not want to play those teams. It's going to be rough. Outside of that, though, is there a team that you're really looking forward to the Pistons matching up with in the first round of the playoffs?
Indiana, easily Indiana. And I feel like that's a matchup that I think the NBA as a whole could really benefit from, because it's not often that, obviously, don't get me wrong, playoff matchups are really intense and it's serious basketball. Every NBA fan loves watching playoff basketball, but there is something to the college rivalry that the Pacers and Pistons kind of seem to have, that really ultimately makes for great television. At the end of the day, that's truly what it is. It's great basketball, and it's a great thing to watch because these are two teams that just genuinely dislike each other. Both teams have been very open about disliking the other, from coaching staffs to just players in general. These are two teams that don't like each other. Indiana got the best of Detroit in the season series, but Detroit did get them in the in-season tournament. It's something that I feel like the league really needs, and I feel like I think back to like that 2021 series with the Hawks and Knicks, like that still gets talked about to this day. And I feel like there really hasn't been much that's captured, for lack of a better term, that's really captured that real hate. You know what I mean? Like it's not a lot of like real hate has been in the playoffs. And I feel like that'd be something that would be seen. And I'd love to see what an Indiana home crowd looks like when Detroit's playing them in the playoffs, because there's so much history also in the rivalry between these two teams. And then also the same for Detroit. Like what does that crowd look like? Because we know Detroit, when it matters the most, the fans are insane, right? Like, granted, like there was a stretch of the season where there was some Jared Goff chants or whatever, but this is a fan base. I'm not going to get into that, but this is a fan base that like lives or dies by their teams, and those are two basketball like teams that have really. I mean, granted, Detroit is a market that kind of, I would say, it's football dominated, but still like has a real love and passion for basketball. And I feel like that's not something you get to see. Like, all due respect to Miami, like they've been in the playoffs for the last few years. Their home crowds like don't really start making much noise until the third or fourth quarter, or even getting to their seats by then. I feel like it's really missing from the league is that kind of college like atmosphere in the playoffs. And I feel like this would be a perfect example. I think the other team Detroit might want to see is New York. It's really like a dual edged thing, because if New York's healthy, that's going to be a hard team to beat regardless. But the issue is, and not to say that, you should be hoping for anything, but like this team has not stayed healthy. And people talk about Tibbs ball, and like that may or may not be a real thing. But like at the end of the day, they've had health issues throughout the year. And like the biggest swing factor is Karl-Anthony Towns. He's hit or miss in the playoffs. How does Jalen Duren, guard him in a playoff series? If Towns is healthy, then that might be a little bit scary for Detroit. But if there's a series or a few games where Cat misses, or he's kind of looking like I want to say the 2022-23 playoffs, that might be a really big thing for Detroit, because I think Cade Cunningham matches up great against Jalen Brunson. I know they might try to switch OG onto him or Josh Hart onto him, but like he's played his best games at MSG. So I feel like this is a team that really needs to see those specific teams in order to really have a shot at winning a playoff series. Because I don't know if I see it with Cleveland or Boston. Honestly, even for that point, like if they end up at 6 and there's a world where Milwaukee's like 3, that's not something you want to see either if you're a Pistons fan.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and just say it now. You're not wanting to see Cleveland or Boston. You're getting swept. Like it's just we have to keep it a buck. If you go against Cleveland or Boston, it's going to be a rough series, and I don't think anyone wants that. And I don't think it seems like, at least I don't believe the Pistons are going to find themselves in the 7th or 8th seed. I think they will be the 6th seed at least, which will be super dope. But I don't see them having to go against them. If they do, that's just going to be rough. My answer is 100% Indiana. I think they can beat Indiana. I think they'll have the best player on the floor. Now, like you've mentioned, the last 2 games Indiana's won. The Pistons did win the in-season tourney, but you've mentioned it. The rivalry with this team is just crazy. Like these teams, these 2 teams hate each other. The players do not like each other. Like I can see at like the Piston home games, people showing up dressed as Legos, like all over the crowd. Like it's gonna be absolutely crazy. Like it would be so fun to watch that, because like you mentioned, we haven't really gotten a series where like since that Trae Young one, like you mentioned, where the teams just actually hate each other, like where you are getting like pure animosity towards each other. And they do have it with the Pistons and Pacers. So I think that's my number one. Want to see it. If you got that series, I think they could win it. And even if they don't win it, I think it would be an extremely fun series. Not like you mentioned, not even just for Pistons fans and Pacers fans. I think it probably would be maybe the most fun playoff matchup of round 1 if you like got that one. So for NBA fans, so I'd love to see that one. I agree with you that if somehow, some way they end up having to play Milwaukee, yeah, that one's also going to be like that one's also going to be a very bad one. They're not big enough to guard Milwaukee. Like it's simple as that. They don't got someone that can guard Giannis. And then, like you've mentioned, Brook Lopez just like turns into Dirk when he plays the Pistons. So, but I do think they match up decently against New York, because I'm sure the Pistons feel like, and Cade feels like, I'm the best player on the floor. Like I don't think he can say that against Milwaukee, obviously. I don't think he's going to say, I don't think you can say that against Boston. I think most people probably would say you can't say that against Cleveland, but I think maybe he would try to make the argument he can. I think he would feel very confident though, where it's not really an argument in his head that he's the best player on the floor if he goes against Indiana or New York. I think he thinks he's straight up better than Jalen Brunson. I think he knows he's straight up better than Tyrese. And in that scenario, you feel comfortable going into those matchups. Now, like you mentioned, the Cat matchup it's going to be a tough one. But in the NBA, having the best player on the court means a lot. And if Cade plays like the best player on the floor against New York or Indiana, I think they have a shot. So those are the two matchups. But Indiana, I think the NBA needs it. Like, I almost want the NBA to cheat and make it to where that happens.
Yeah, I feel like that's a matchup that's just got, like, historically, there's so much there, and there's just, like, also a renewed rivalry now this season. Like, it feel like such a missed opportunity if these teams don't see each other in the playoffs. I think one thing that kind of hasn't also been touched on a lot, pause, with the playoff talk for the Pistons is Cade, right? Like, obviously Cade's an all-star. He's gotten, more national attention than he ever has in the NBA so far. Like, he hasn't gotten this much since draft night. I think the biggest thing though is people haven't, for the most part, gotten to actually watch him play basketball on a national stage. The one game they had, he was out with injury, resting against Philly. I think a lot of people don't really know how special of a talent Cade Cunningham like truly is. And I feel like it kind of feels like Detroit is in the position that Minnesota was in a couple years ago, where they have this emerging superstar that's like just ready to get all the national media love. It's just has to be seen in the national media. And I feel like this is really like a turning point for Cade is the playoffs, because if he goes to the playoffs and he's a playoff riser, as I think most everybody expects him to be, that's going to do so much for his superstardom as a whole, and his reputation around the league. That's going to really start changing things in terms of like players, kind of like how Duren forced his way to San Antonio. Like, you might start seeing stuff like that a little more, with more national spotlight on Cade. And if they get a playoff series win, even, that's going to do a whole lot. And people are going to start really, like, obviously not that like he's completely, not getting any attention or anything like that, but really seeing it in action in the highest stakes possible, I feel like is going to do so much for Cade. And I think that's really what's going to be that next step.
I can't wait for it. I can't believe that if you would have told me at the beginning of the year this was conversations we were having in February, like, I would not have believed you at all. I would have thought you were lying, and I would have told you you're crazy. But Pistons are in a good position. They're playing great, and let's see what happens. Let's see who they get matched up with. Let's see how this final stretch goes and see how the playoffs go. But that's all we've got for you guys today. Thank you, Czar, for joining the podcast. As always, Sixth Man of the Year. Appreciate you. You guys can
Yes,
check out
sir.
his
Put
work.
that on wax.
You can go follow him over at Bully Ball Media as well. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. Until next time, peace out, everybody.